Okay, hello everyone. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me okay. If somebody could drop a note in the chat, I'd appreciate it. And just let me know that I'm coming through loud and clear. Awesome, thank you so much. So hello again, everyone, and welcome. Again, my name is Amelia Amick. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm currently located in scenic Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'd like to acknowledge that my presentation is being recorded on the traditional lands of the Shawnee and Osage peoples. I'm going to turn my camera off so I don't distract myself. And before we get started, a note about our organization, the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCAHA. We are a nonprofit paper conservation lab and preservation education organization, and we also offer digitization and framing services. CCAHA is based in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all around the country. You can learn more about us and what we do at our website, ccaha.org. So today's program is the second of 4 in our Volunteer Here series, which is geared toward volunteers that work with collections as well as staff that run collection-centered volunteer programs. We designed this series with small institutions in mind. In last week's session, and again today, we will revisit the basics of working in a collections volunteer program within the backdrop of the new normal. And it's my hope that you'll come away from today's session with some good resources that you can use to better prepare yourselves for returning to work with collections. And again, we'll share a resource page later via email that includes links to the sites we'll talk about today and some other material. And lastly, as mentioned, we have time set aside at the end for questions and comments, and we are hoping to hear from you. I think we're all aware that discussions around COVID-19 can elicit a range of opinions and responses. So we respectfully ask that engaging or commenting with other participants, you please keep these guidelines in mind. So all of that said, and thanks for bearing with me, let's get going. Whether you have been back on site for a while, or you've just recently returned, or maybe you're not able to go back just yet. Wherever you are in your volunteer efforts, I want to say thank you for staying interested and connected and for helping to care for collections in these challenging times. Your dedication is appreciated by so many of us who love your museums and libraries and historic spaces. So thank you for doing what you do. Let's get started with a quick poll. Alana, if you can hear me, if we could please unleash the poll question. The poll question is aimed at everyone. If you have returned to your volunteering, or if you're not able or ready or allowed to return on site, I'd like to know what concerns, if any, have you had about returning to on-site collections volunteer work since the pandemic began? And just to clarify, when we're talking about collections volunteers, we're talking about volunteers who are working directly with collections, whether that's in registration, processing, helping with installation, direct roles in collections care. And I also want to say, though we're not specifically looking at interns today, I think a lot of what we'll talk about can relate to volunteer interns. I'm sure many of you may have interns who work with collections as part of their time at your institution. So we'll give the poll a little bit more time, and I'll check in, or Alana, if you can just send me a message when we have a quorum, feel free to read the poll results out. We'll sort it out that way. So one of the major challenges mentioned by many institutions who have reopened is getting their volunteers to return to in-person work. Now, it should be acknowledged that there are differences in the work done by public-facing volunteers who lead tours and engage directly with visitors, and collections volunteers who probably work more in the back of house and may only interact with select staff members. But I think in general, a lot of the concerns expressed are similar for all types of volunteers. The conversation about volunteer retention in terms of COVID safety and returning on site has been happening for a while now and is still very much ongoing. And so I think we have some poll results. So let's take a look at those and see. So what concerns, if any, have you had about returning to on-site collections volunteer work? Concerns about masking, social distancing, and vaccine policies, that's a big one, 61%. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Balancing out a little bit more, concerns about being able to relearn the work you were doing and just uncomfortable being around other people right now, both significant percentages there. So that's good. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. I realize other is a little bit of a big blank there to fill in. There are obviously lots of reasons, but it's good to see that mix from this group today. So thank you for chiming in. So a thread appeared just last month in Museum Junction, which is an open forum of the American Alliance of Museums. And it started with this exact question: is anyone struggling to get volunteers to come back in during the current pandemic? The poster who asked this question said that she was a new volunteer coordinator and she was having trouble getting volunteers to cover shifts for tours and programs, and she was concerned it was something she was doing in her process. The post got several responses that offered reassurance that the writer was not alone, and here are a few of those comments. A lot of sites have been seeing at least some percentage of volunteers hesitant or unable or unwilling to return to on-site work since the pandemic began. And in many places that's still unfolding. And so if you yourself have been hesitant in any way to get back to volunteering in person, please know that you're not alone. If you are starting to think about rejoining your site's volunteer program, be aware that the cultural field has been doing a lot of talking about volunteerism in the pandemic, and many sites have shared ideas and models that can help you. Online communities like Museum Junction can be a good place to start looking to see what's being talked about. And you do see folks who are volunteers post comments there. Another resource is the American Association for Museum Volunteers, or AAMV. In July 2020, they released the results of a survey they did with volunteer managers, asking questions related to the impact of COVID and volunteer engagement and training. They later did the survey again with some tweaks, and they posted those results in March of this year. You can download the survey results on the AAMV website. And if you haven't taken a look at these, I would encourage you to do so. The comments and suggestions are super interesting, and it gives you a look at some of the concerns that other volunteers are expressing in terms of returning to work and COVID safety. It also offers ideas for ways that sites have been trying to keep volunteers engaged, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. As you are perhaps personally aware and can certainly well imagine, there are many reasons that volunteers may be hesitant or unable to return right now. Here you see listed a few common concerns captured by the AAMV surveys on the right-hand side of the screen. COVID safety is definitely the major theme. And you can look at the kinds of questions others have raised and see if those might apply to your own situation and your institution. But being proactive about identifying your concerns, if you have any, and sharing them with your supervisor can help your site plan to put strategies in place where that's possible to try to help you and other volunteers feel more comfortable returning to work. For example, we know that for a lot of folks, their schedules have shifted, maybe due to personal commitments or other work obligations. If that's a concern for you, you may want to talk with your supervisor about ways you can make your projects more flexible and accommodating, to help you feel better about adding your volunteer shifts back into your schedule. From a collections management standpoint, it's always important to make sure the work you're doing follows approved guidelines and is well documented. This helps to ensure consistency in intellectual and physical control of the collection, among other points. As we have certainly seen over the past 18 months plus, situations can shift quickly. If you as a volunteer choose not to come back, or you're unable to come back for a while, and you're in the middle of a project, are there written notes that will enable someone else to pick up where you left off or help guide you when you return? If your supervisor is not able to come back to the office for a while, do you know the plan for who you can contact or go to with questions? And if your whole site closes suddenly and no one is allowed to come in for days or weeks, are the artifacts secure? It's so easy to leave a collection out on a processing table while you're working on it. And I have been guilty of that myself 100%. But the pandemic has reminded us that we need to consider what happens if we go home on Friday and we're not permitted to come back in on Monday. It's also important to have up-to-date policies for collections management activities. Many organizations have used COVID shutdowns or slower periods right now to create or revise their collections management policies and procedures and other core documents for the institution. It can be a challenge for staff to find time to add in this work, especially if they've been given additional responsibilities during the pandemic. But this may be something that interested volunteers can help with. If you want to learn more about creating collections policies and procedures, there are many great free resources out there, and a few of these are included in the resource list we'll send out. There's certainly a lot to think about, and we cannot prepare for every scenario. But we can set ourselves up to better respond to challenges by having plans and guidelines in place that help minimize the risk to collections. If you're returning to a site that has been open for a while now, hopefully they will have information ready for you about their COVID safety initiatives for staff and visitors. If you're not given info ahead of time, it's definitely something you may want to ask about. Find out about your organization's current protocol for health screening, masking, and social distancing, as well as any changes or restrictions to how people move through the building spaces. Maybe certain galleries are still closed, or there are restrictions on how many people can be in your elevator, things like that. Make sure you know who you can go to with questions about the protocol. We know that some people may be more comfortable asking questions about COVID safety in an anonymous format. And if that's not something your site has available, maybe you can suggest an option like a comment box or an electronic response form. In being upfront about the steps they're taking to reduce the spread of COVID, an organization demonstrates to its volunteers that they value your safety and they're helping to reduce the chance for confusion when everyone does get on site. Is your institution requiring everyone to complete a self-reported health questionnaire before arriving each day? Have they implemented new cleaning procedures? Have they added time or capacity restrictions on break room areas? These are basic things a site should share to make sure you know what's expected of you and to help you feel informed. It's also important for your organization to know who is on site and when, certainly in terms of COVID safety, but also for general security practices. For many reasons, it's helpful for you to log your shift days and hours. If your site does not currently have you keep track of your working hours, this is a good time to start that practice, and it can be a very simple timesheet form. I wanted to look quickly at vaccination policies because we are starting to see cultural organizations requiring their staff to be vaccinated against COVID. Vaccination policies, specifically regarding volunteers, is a topic that's currently being talked about in places like Museum Junction. As with other businesses, you'll see sites with different protocols for vaccinated and unvaccinated staff. Here again, it's helpful to know what's expected from you and all staff in COVID protocols. Some places are using separate forms specifically to document vaccine status, as in this example of a self-certification of vaccination status form. This form was shared on Museum Junction by the director of a history museum in California. The director added that their museum is having volunteers indicate that they are either vaccinated or, if unvaccinated, being tested weekly, in addition to asking everyone to stay home if they're not feeling well. Right now, it seems like a mix. You'll see sites respond and say they're requiring their volunteers to be vaccinated if they're also requiring it for staff, while other sites have not yet expanded requirements to volunteers. A vaccination policy may not be something your organization is able to address at this time, but it should at least be on their radar as a possible question. And if it's something that's a concern to you, ask. Budgeting for extra supplies is another thing most sites should already be thinking about. And there's been some time for organizations to hopefully plan for this in their budgets. But you may want to ask about what supplies the site will have and what, if anything, they may need more of, or you may need to bring in from home. Will your site have enough disposable masks, plenty of hand soap, paper towels, and hand sanitizer? All of the fun accessories we've come to expect in the pandemic. I also want to mention something that just came across the wire yesterday here in the US, since I didn't incorporate it into this slide here, but I did want to mention it. And that's that FEMA, our Federal Emergency Management Agency, is offering retroactive reimbursement for purchases associated with safe opening and operations. And they are dating this specifically to address COVID, and they are dating this back now to January 20th of 2020. And it also extends through the end of this year, so December 31st. This is a new update, and I don't know much about the details, but it seems like something that could be worth pursuing for nonprofit organizations. Items that might be eligible for reimbursement under this program include face coverings, cleaning and disinfection supplies, handheld temperature measuring devices, PPE, personal protective equipment, and things like portable temporary physical barriers that were used for social distancing. They want questions for this to be directed to the regional FEMA office in your area, and I'll include a link to both the FEMA policy and the page on their website where you can find your region in the resources list. I can't let supplies go by without showing a few fun masks. Something we saw fairly quickly at the start of the pandemic was institutions producing their own branded masks or masks based on items in their collection. There are some really cool object-inspired masks online, and I love seeing what different sites do with these. If your site has made masks, I hope they're kindly able to give you one. If your site hasn't made masks, it may be something you can suggest or help the staff to pursue. Speaking also of hand sanitizer and using it around collections, I wanted to mention the Library of Congress's hand sanitizer study. As we all know from our pandemic diaries, hand sanitizer quickly appeared seemingly everywhere. The Library of Congress's Preservation Research and Testing Division designed a short study to look at the potential effect of hand sanitizer transferred from our hands to collection items. They looked at materials that are common in the library's collection and in most collections, including 5 kinds of paper, book cloth, parchment, and leather. And they looked at 2 classes of hand sanitizer, alcohol-based and water-based. A few takeaways from the study. They found that the use of hand sanitizer does indeed introduce a measurable risk of transferring residues that can cause discoloration in objects. If hand sanitizers are used, allow your hands to thoroughly dry to reduce the potential for transferring sanitizer to the object. Alcohol-based sanitizers showed more harmful results than the water-based sanitizer. So while washing and drying your hands often and well remains the preferred option in working with collections and from a human safety standpoint, if hand sanitizers are used around collections, water-based sanitizers are preferred. Another fantastic resource that came about in the pandemic and may be of interest to you is the REALM research project. REALM is a collaboration between OCLC, which is a global library cooperative, the Federal Institute of Museum and Library Services, and Battelle, which is an applied science research and development company. There were questions about human safety and collections objects that popped up pretty quickly in the pandemic, especially for institutions with circulating collections. The REALM project has helped us better understand how the virus interacts with collection objects and materials that are used in collection spaces. REALM has worked with the Library of Congress, the National Archives and Records Administration, the National Park Service, and many other cultural organizations. The REALM website has resources designed specifically for archives, libraries, and museums, including a number of free webinars. You can download the test results and go deep into the data if you like. But if you or your site have questions about the virus and collections materials, REALM is a super helpful resource. So we've talked about this in a few ways today, but the need for frequent and clear communication is a point that surfaces often in the volunteer experience. During pandemic closures or slow times, and also for volunteers who aren't ready or able to return to on-site work, hopefully your organization is keeping you posted on the status of the site and changes to their COVID safety protocols, as well as updates on exhibitions and programming. And there are many good suggestions out there for more content-specific ways that sites are trying to engage with their volunteers. Here are just a few ideas. The AAMV surveys are a good place for inspiration on this. And the points here were adapted from a webinar that was produced by the Ohio Museums Association. Part of this is the more personal side of volunteering, remembering to set aside time to say hello and check in with each other. I think especially in small institutions, staff and volunteers often know each other very well. And so part of that is keeping that communication open. Listening is another important part of that communication. It's great for volunteers to have a forum to be heard. And here again, keep in mind that especially right now, folks may prefer an anonymous format to relay concerns. Certainly out of necessity, a lot of the ideas for engagement right now are virtual, meaning if you're tuning in from home, you need access to the internet and a computer and some technical know-how. And this can be a challenge and present barriers for people. There are, of course, still ways to talk that don't involve a computer. If you look at the AAMV studies and elsewhere, there are comments about staff picking up the phone and calling volunteers, and volunteers creating similar phone trees to keep their group connected. And of course, some volunteers may benefit more from getting hard copies of articles and other material in the mail if they don't have access or prefer not to use computers. It's helpful to let your supervisor know what formats are best for you, but try to make sure it's still workable for the staff who are leading your volunteer program. Even if you aren't sure if you and other volunteers would really latch on to doing things through Zoom and other online platforms, it might be worth exploring. One silver lining that's often referenced is that the pandemic experience has encouraged people to become more comfortable using online meeting formats. Online training sessions or presentations from your site's director or a curator can allow volunteers who aren't ready or able to return on site to stay informed. If these sessions are recorded, it gives volunteers the flexibility to watch live if they can, or check it out later as your time permits. Another option is to have volunteers create programming to share either within the volunteer corps or maybe even for the larger public audience. You and your fellow volunteers may have your own research interests or familiarity with a specific part of the collection that others would enjoy hearing about. There's an article in the current issue of Museum Magazine that looks at virtual programs designed for older adults by staff at the Anchorage Museum. And they offered a few great tips on improving the virtual program experience. And you're seeing some of those on this screen. I think these are helpful things to keep in mind when creating virtual programs for anyone, but especially for volunteers who may not have as much familiarity with online programming. For volunteers who are open to receiving electronic resources, there is a wide world of webinars and online offerings related to preservation and collections care. A lot of this material is available free and on demand, and it can be shared as continuing education or as a catalyst for virtual chats, maybe asking folks to share something interesting they learned in a particular webinar. I would, of course, encourage you to keep tabs on the programming we do here at CCAHA and to look at the free recordings on our YouTube channel. Another awesome resource is the Connecting to Collections Care program, which offers a free online listserv community and free webinars on all kinds of collections care topics. So I'd like to wrap up by saying that as you return or plan to return to collections volunteering, it's a good time to think about the kinds of collections work you have done and make sure what you're doing is aligned with the relevant standards and best practices for your organization. What kinds of projects could volunteers like you do in the future? What parts of the volunteer program could be strengthened? How can your site be more inclusive in its volunteer recruitment? Having an open dialogue between the volunteers and staff can benefit the volunteer experience and the daily work of the organization. In that Museum Junction thread that we talked about earlier, there was a comment made that I thought was a very smart observation. The comment was from a staff person who said that in her opinion, while the volunteers' experience essentially froze the day the museum initially closed, the museum has continued to operate, and normal looks a lot different than what the volunteers are accustomed to. This comment to me is a great reminder, first for staff, that many volunteers are returning to altered landscapes in their volunteer experience. The flip side of that is, for returning volunteers, keep in mind that your site and staff likely also had challenges in the past 18 months. Maybe there were furloughs and layoffs. Maybe the site is battling with lost revenue and reduced visitors, among other things. The new normal is different for a lot of us, and some extra patience and flexibility may benefit the transition back to the office for everyone. It's certainly a reality that for many small sites, volunteers fill key roles with collections, and you can be great ambassadors for the organizations you work with. Finding ways to stay connected and continue that relationship with your site is a positive way you can support the collections and the institution in these curious times. And with that, I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your time today. My email address is listed here. If you have questions or want to drop me a note later on, please do. One of the best parts of my job is getting to connect people with resources that help them. I assuredly do not have all the answers, but I will do my best to help you find them. And I'm fortunate to get to draw on the knowledge of my talented colleagues at CCAHA. Again, we'll email a resource page that includes links to the sites mentioned today. I hope these will be helpful for you and your organizations as you navigate the road ahead. And I also hope you'll join us for the 2 upcoming sessions in this series, both of which will offer practical training in collections related topics that can be used for training volunteers in collections-based work. So if there are any questions in the chat, we can take a look at those now. And if not, again, thank you so much, everyone. Let's see, Claudia, can you mention the name of a water-based hand sanitizer? I cannot, but the 2 links to the Library of Congress sources may have one. I can follow up on that and send you a note later on. That's a good question. Let's see. Masks are awesome. Thank you for showing. No problem. I love seeing what different museums do with those masks. Let's see. I don't think I'm seeing any other questions. If anybody has something later on, again, please feel free to reach out to me. So give it a few more seconds to see if anything pops up. So again, the next two sessions in this series are on the upcoming Tuesdays. You can sign up on our website if you haven't already, and I hope you'll take a look if that's of interest to you. Not seeing any other questions, I would like to formally end the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time today, and be safe out there. Take care.